Welcome back to the Book Nook, everyone. We love to explore big ideas here, and today, well, we're tackling one of the biggest, economics.
Economics, yeah. It could sound intimidating, right? Like all those charts and graphs and jargon.
Right, like who even remembers what supply and demand really means?
But honestly, economics is just the story of how we make decisions about stuff when there's not enough to go around.
Okay, so maybe not as scary as it sounds.
Exactly. It's actually pretty fascinating once you start seeing the world through this economic lens. Like, why is your favorite coffee so expensive right now? Or, why did that bookstore on Main Street have to close?
See, now that's stuff we all think about.
Totally. And that's what we're diving deep into today. We'll be using Thomas Sowell's Basic Economic as our guide.
Ah, yes, the book you recommended. Everyone, this book is amazing for, actually making sense of this stuff without needing a PhD.
Right. Sowell, he has a way of cutting through the complexity and showing how even simple economic truths can have huge consequences. Like, he talks about how ignoring basic economics can lead to, well, some serious economic disasters.
So, no pressure then.
Well, hopefully by the end of this deep dive, we'll all be a bit more econ savvy, or at least, less likely to fall for those common economic myths.
Sounds like a plan. Let's jump right in. So first things first, what is economics really about? I mean, you mentioned stuff and not having enough. What's Sowell's take on this?
Okay, so Sowell's point is that economics, at its core, is about scarcity. It's the idea that we have unlimited wants, right? Like, we always want more stuff, more experiences, more everything. But the resources we need to fulfill those wants, they're limited. There's simply not enough to go around.
Ah, the classic problem of having too much month left at the end of the money, right?
Ah, exactly. And that's true whether we're talking about individuals or entire societies. Every economic system, whether it's capitalism, socialism, you name it, it's just a different way of dealing with this fundamental scarcity.
Okay, so scarcity is like the base of the economic pyramid. But it's not just about not having enough, is it? It's also about how we use the resources we do have, right?
You got it. Resources have what Sowell calls alternative uses. Like, take water, for example. We can drink it, sure, but we can also use it to irrigate crops, generate electricity, or, even make ice sculptures.
Or, let's not forget, water balloon fights.
Exactly. The point is, we have to choose how to use those limited resources. Every choice means we give up something else. And that's a trade-off.
Trade-offs, right. So economics is essentially the study of how societies navigate these trade-offs, trying to get the most out of the limited resources they have.
That's the heart of it. It's about production. How do we turn those scarce resources, the inputs, into the goods and services, the outputs that we want and need? And how do we do it in the most efficient way possible?
This is where things start to feel really complicated. I mean, think about a modern economy. Millions of people, businesses, all making decisions about what to produce, buy, sell. How does it all even work?
Right. It's mind-boggling. And this is where one of Sowell's key insights comes in. Prices. Prices act like signals in the economy, constantly communicating information about what people want, how much of it they want, and what they're willing to pay for it.
So prices aren't just some random number. They're like this.
Language.
Yes, the language of the market.
Perfect analogy. Like, if the price of your favorite coffee goes up, that's the market signaling that maybe there's a shortage of coffee beans, or that, more people want coffee than usual.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do those signals actually lead to, more coffee being produced or, say, more houses being built if there's a housing shortage?
Think of it like a giant feedback loop. Higher prices incentivize producers to, well, produce more. Why? Because they can make more profit.
So it's not necessarily about greed, like some people say. It's just, businesses responding to these price signals.
Exactly. Take the housing market, for example. If there's a housing shortage, prices go up. This encourages developers to build more houses because they can sell them for more money. At the same time, those higher prices might also encourage some people to, delay buying a house or consider moving to a less expensive area.
It's like the market is constantly adjusting, trying to find a balance between what people want and what's available.
Right. And it's happening all the time, in every market, for every product and service imaginable. It's this dynamic, ever-shifting process that's driven by these price signals.
I'm starting to see why Sowell called his book Basic Economics. I mean, the concept of prices as signals, it's simple but so powerful.
It really is, and it helps explain why centrally planned economies, where the government tries to set prices and control production, often run into problems. Sowell tells this story about Boris Yeltsin, the former Russian president.
Oh, I remember that story. Something about a supermarket.
Right. So Yeltsin, he's visiting the U.S. in 1989. He's used to, the Soviet system where there are constant shortages and empty shelves. And then he walks into a regular American supermarket in Houston, and he's just blown away. The sheer abundance, the variety of goods, it was like nothing he'd ever seen before.
So even a supermarket can be an economics lesson.
Totally. It showed Yeltsin the stark contrast between a market economy where prices guide resource allocation and a centrally planned economy where those signals are, well, basically muted.
Okay, that's a pretty powerful visual. So let's say the market is, mostly doing its thing. Prices are sending their signals, resources are being allocated. But things don't always go perfectly, right? What happens when businesses make mistakes? Like they produce something that people don't actually want.
Well, that's where the beauty of the market system shines through. Mistakes are inevitable, but the market has a built-in mechanism for correcting them. Losses.
So if a business makes a bad bet, they lose money.
Exactly. And those losses, they're crucial. They signal that resources are being misused, that they could be used more productively elsewhere.
So a failing business isn't necessarily a bad thing for the overall economy.
Not necessarily. It's like pruning a tree. You get rid of the dead branches to allow the healthy ones to flourish. Those losses, they force businesses to adapt, become more efficient, or, sometimes they just go out of business entirely.
And that frees up those resources for other businesses, potentially ones that will use them more wisely.
Exactly. It's this constant process of experimentation and adaptation, and it's all driven by the pursuit of profit and the fear of loss. Sowell really emphasizes that both profit and loss are essential ingredients for a healthy market economy.
It's like a natural selection process, but for businesses. Now, what about those situations where we hear about shortages, like a shortage of computer chips or, housing in a certain city? How does the market handle those?
Shortages are basically a signal that at the current price, demand exceeds supply. And, you guessed it, prices play a key role in resolving this.
So prices go up.
Right. And those higher prices do a couple of things. First, they encourage people to conserve. Like if gasoline prices spike, people might drive less, carpool more, or, finally get that bike out of the garage.
And second,
Second, and this is the big one, higher prices encourage producers to increase supply. That higher price means there's more potential profit to be made, so businesses have a strong incentive to ramp up production or even enter a new market.
so in theory, a shortage should eventually correct itself as the market responds to those price signals.
That's the idea. Of course, it doesn't always happen instantly. There might be delays as businesses adjust, but those higher prices are basically a call to action for suppliers.
Okay, this makes sense. But what happens when the government steps in and tries to manipulate prices, like with rent control, for example?
Rent control. A classic example of good intentions gone awry. Sowell explains that when you cap rents below the market rate, you essentially create a permanent shortage.
Because the landlords aren't going to be as willing to rent out their properties if they can't charge what the market would bear.
Exactly. And it discourages new construction, too. Why would a developer build new apartments if they can't rent them at a price that makes it worthwhile?
So you end up with fewer available apartments, and the ones that are available might not be in the best shape because landlords have less incentive to maintain them.
Right. It's one of those situations where a policy designed to help people, in this case renters, can actually end up hurting them in the long run. And it's not just theory. Sowell points to real-world examples, like rent control in England and Wales, where it led to a sharp decline in the availability of private rental housing.
It's a reminder that sometimes the best solution is to let the market do its thing, even if it means some prices might seem high. Now, what about other types of price controls, like when governments try to cap the price of gasoline or medicine?
Same principle, different product. When you set a price ceiling below the market equilibrium, you create a shortage. We saw this with gasoline price controls in the U.S. in the 1970s. Even though there wasn't a major drop in the supply of gasoline, the price controls led to long lines at gas stations, rationing, and even a black market for gas.
Wow, so even if there's enough gasoline to go around, price controls can mess things up.
They can. Because the price doesn't reflect the true scarcity, people keep demanding more gas than is available at that artificially low price. And suppliers have no incentive to increase production or move gas to where it's most needed because, well, they're not being compensated for it.
It's like the price system, it's this delicate balancing act, and when you throw a wrench in it, even with good intentions, things can go haywire. Now, let's flip the script and talk about price floors. These are situations where the government sets a minimum price for something, right?
Exactly. A common example is agricultural price supports, where the government guarantees farmers a certain price for their crops, regardless of the market price.
And the idea here is to protect farmers' incomes.
Right. But just like with price ceilings, price floors can have unintended consequences. If the government sets the price floor above the market price, farmers are incentivized to produce more, even if there's not enough demand at that higher price.
And that's how you end up with those images of like mountains of surplus cheese or grain.
Exactly. And it's not just storage costs. It can distort the whole agricultural market, lead to overproduction of certain crops, and even harm the environment. Sowell gives this example from India, where the government was spending more money storing surplus food than it was on education and healthcare combined.
Wow. Okay, so price controls, whether they're ceilings or floors, they can really backfire. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about one of Sowell's key distinctions: systemic causation versus intentional explanations. What does he mean by that?
It's about understanding the difference between actions and outcomes. We often try to explain economic events by focusing on people's intentions. Like, if prices are rising, we might blame it on greedy businesses.
Right, it's easy to point fingers.
But Sowell's point is that many economic outcomes are the result of complex, impersonal forces within the system itself. Those rising prices might be due to increased demand, a shortage of raw materials, or a whole host of other factors that have nothing to do with anyone's evil intentions.
So instead of just blaming people, we need to understand the underlying economic forces at play.
Exactly. And this is crucial for crafting effective policies. Like if you think high interest rates in low-income neighborhoods are solely due to predatory lenders, you might be tempted to impose strict interest rate caps.
Which sounds like a good idea on the surface.
Right. But it could actually make things worse by reducing the availability of credit in those communities, potentially driving people to even shadier lenders.
It's another example of how well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences if we don't understand the bigger economic picture. Now let's talk about businesses. They're obviously central to any economy, but Sowell looks beyond just their role in making profits. What are some of his key insights?
Sowell emphasizes that businesses, even when they're pursuing profit, are playing a vital role in the allocation of scarce resources. They're constantly experimenting, trying new ideas, and responding to those price signals we talked about earlier.
And sometimes those experiments fail.
Right. And those failures are important too. They're part of the market's learning process. They show what doesn't work, what consumers don't value, and they free up resources for other businesses to use more effectively.
It's like that saying, fail fast and fail often.
Exactly. And this constant churn, this process of success and failure, it drives innovation, efficiency, and ultimately lower prices and better products for consumers.
So it's not just about individual businesses succeeding or failing. It's about the overall dynamism of the market and how it constantly pushes towards improvement. Now, Sowell mentions Lenin's experience after the Russian Revolution as a lesson in the importance of market signals. What happened there?
So after the Bolsheviks take power, they try to implement a fully centrally planned economy. No private property, no markets, the government controls everything. And, well, it was a disaster. The economy collapses, there are widespread shortages and even famine.
So even with the best of intentions, trying to run an economy from the top down just doesn't work.
It's incredibly difficult, if not impossible. The amount of information needed to make all those economic decisions, to allocate resources efficiently, it's overwhelming. Prices in a market economy, they do this automatically, constantly adjusting to reflect changes in supply and demand.
It's like trying to micromanage a beehive.
Perfect analogy. Lenin himself eventually realized this and introduced the new economic policy, which allowed for some limited market activity. It was a tacit admission that the purely socialist model wasn't working.
Okay, so market signals matter. Now, let's talk about competition. It's often portrayed as this cutthroat, dog-eat-dog world. But Sowell sees it differently, right?
He argues that competition, while it might be tough on individual businesses, is ultimately a good thing for consumers and the overall economy. It forces businesses to be more efficient, to innovate, and to offer lower prices.
Because if you don't keep up with the competition, you're going to lose customers.
Exactly. And this constant pressure to improve, it drives progress and leads to a higher standard of living for everyone. Think about the technology industry. The intense competition between companies like Apple and Samsung, it's led to amazing innovations in smartphones that we all benefit from.
So competition is like this invisible force that's constantly pushing the economy forward. Now, Sowell also touches on the limits of scale and the role of intermediaries, things that we often don't think about.
Right. Economies of scale, the idea that bigger is always better, it does have its limits. Beyond a certain size, businesses can become too bureaucratic, too slow to adapt. And intermediaries like wholesalers and retailers, while they might seem like extra steps in the process, they actually play a crucial role in making the market more efficient.
How so?
Well, think about all the small purchases you make. It wouldn't be very efficient if you had to buy everything directly from the manufacturer, would it?
No, that would be a logistical nightmare.
Right. Intermediaries, they connect buyers and sellers, they handle logistics, and they often make it possible for consumers to buy goods in smaller quantities at more affordable prices.
They're like the unsung heroes of the market system.
Exactly. They make the whole system run more smoothly. Now let's move on to one of Sowell's core principles, the importance of private property. Why does he see this as so essential for a thriving economy? It comes back to incentives. When individuals and businesses have the right to own and control property, they have a strong incentive to use it productively and to take care of it. They benefit directly from their efforts.
Because it's theirs.
Exactly. And if they misuse it or neglect it, they bear the costs. In centrally planned economies where the government owns most of the property, those incentives are weaker. People are less likely to be as invested in taking care of something that doesn't belong to them.
It's like the difference between renting an apartment and owning a house. You're probably going to take better care of your own house.
Exactly. And that difference in ownership, it has huge implications for how resources are allocated and how efficiently they're used.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, corporations are obviously a major part of the modern economy. What are Salah's thoughts on the corporate structure with its separation of ownership and management?
He recognizes that it has its advantages and disadvantages. On the one hand, it allows for the pooling of capital from many investors and specialized management. But on the other hand, it can create conflicts of interest between shareholders who own the company and managers who run it.
And that can lead to situations where managers prioritize their own interests over the interests of the shareholders.
It can, and we've certainly seen examples of corporate scandals where that's happened. But Sowell's point is that these problems aren't inherent to the corporate structure itself. They're problems of human nature, and they can occur in any type of organization.
So the key is having mechanisms in place to ensure accountability regardless of the organizational structure.
Right? Transparency, oversight, and legal consequences for wrongdoing, those are all important for mitigating those risks.
Now, what happens when competition breaks down, when you have monopolies or cartels controlling a market?
Monopolies and cartels, they essentially stifle competition, and that's bad news for consumers. They can restrict output, raise prices, and offer lower quality goods or services.
Because they don't face the same pressure to improve that you get in a competitive market.
Exactly. They have less incentive to innovate or keep prices low because they don't have to worry about losing customers to competitors. That's why governments often try to regulate monopolies or break them up through antitrust laws.
But Sala seems skeptical about how effective those government interventions can be. Why is that?
He argues that it's incredibly difficult for regulators to set the right price or determine the optimal level of output. Markets are constantly changing, and regulators often lack the information or the flexibility to keep up.
It's like trying to hit a moving target with a very slow arrow.
Right, and there's also the risk of regulatory capture, where the regulations end up benefiting the companies they're supposed to be regulating.
So it's a tricky balance to strike between preventing anti-competitive behavior and avoiding regulation that stifle innovation and efficiency. Now, Sowell introduces this concept of the fallacy of proposition. What is that exactly?
It's the mistake of assuming that what's true for an individual is automatically true for the group as a whole. Like if one person stands up at a concert to get a better view, it works for them. But if everyone stands up, no one sees any better.
So what worked at a small scale doesn't necessarily work at a large scale. How does this apply to economics?
Well, it's tempting to think that policies designed to help individuals will automatically help the entire economy. But that's not always the case. Sowell argues that policies like minimum wage laws, while they might benefit some individual workers, can actually lead to job losses overall, particularly for less skilled workers.
Because businesses might not be able to afford to hire as many people at the higher wage.
Exactly. So while the intention is good, the outcome can be quite different at the aggregate level.
It's a reminder to think about the systemic effects of policies, not just their impact on individuals. Now let's talk about productivity and pay. What determines how much people get paid?
Sowell's answer is pretty straightforward. In the long run, your pay is largely determined by your productivity, the value of the goods or services you produce. The more productive you are, the more valuable you are to an employer, and the more they can afford to pay you.
So it's not just about working hard, it's about working smart.
Right. It's about producing something that other people value and are willing to pay for. Of course, supply and demand also matter. If there's a high demand for a particular skill but only a few people who have it, those people can command higher wages.
It's like the market for software engineers right now.
Exactly. But even then, there's a limit. Employers won't pay you more than the value you generate of their business.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about those discussions of income inequality? Are the rich just getting richer while the poor get poorer?
Sowell cautions against looking at income distribution as this static snapshot. People move between income brackets over their lifetimes. Someone might start out in a lower income bracket early in their career and move to a higher one as they gain experience and skills.
So it's not just a fixed group of rich and poor.
Right, there's a lot of income mobility over time. And Sowell also points out that those discussions often focus on income and ignore wealth. Wealth, what you own, is a better measure of your overall financial well-being.
So someone might have a high income but a lot of debt, which would affect their overall wealth.
Exactly. It's important to look at the whole picture.
Now, what about the pay gap between men and women? What are some of the economic factors that contribute to that?
Sowell acknowledges that discrimination can play a role, but he also highlights other factors like differences in career choices and the impact of family responsibilities.
So it's not just about outright discrimination.
Right. For example, women might be more likely to choose careers that offer more flexibility, even if they pay less, in order to balance work and family responsibilities.
It's a complex issue with multiple factors at play. Now, let's talk about speculation. It often gets a bad rap, but Sowell argues that it plays an important economic role. How so?
Speculation, essentially betting on future price movements, it helps to manage risk. Think about a farmer who's worried about the price of wheat dropping before they harvest their crop.
That's a big risk for them.
Right. A speculator might be willing to buy that wheat in advance at the same price, taking on the risk of the price dropping. This allows the farmer to lock in a price and reduce their uncertainty.
So the speculator is basically providing a service to the farmer by absorbing some of their risk.
Exactly. And of course, the speculator is hoping to profit by selling the wheat later at a higher price. But that's the nature of risk and reward.
Okay, that makes sense. What about insurance? How does that fit into the picture?
Insurance is another way of managing risk. Instead of one individual bearing all the risk of something bad happening, like a fire or a car accident, the risk is spread among a large pool of people who pay premiums.
And if something bad does happen to one of those people, the insurance company pays for the damages.
Right. It's a way of transferring and mitigating risk.
Okay, so both speculation and insurance are essentially ways of dealing with the inherent uncertainty of the future.
Exactly. They're tools for managing risk, and risk management is a crucial part of any economy.
Now, let's talk about a topic that often causes confusion and anxiety: inflation. What are some core economic principles to keep in mind here?
Sowell emphasizes that a nation's wealth is measured by the real goods and services it produces, not just the amount of money in circulation. Printing more money doesn't create more wealth, it just devalues the existing money.
So if everyone suddenly has twice as much money, prices just go up.
That's the basic idea. Inflation erodes the purchasing power of money. Those who are on fixed incomes, like retirees, are particularly vulnerable to inflation because their income doesn't keep pace with rising prices.
It's like their money is literally losing value over time.
Exactly. And it can also distort investment decisions and make it harder for businesses to plan for the future.
Okay, so inflation is generally a bad thing. What about deflation, where prices are falling?
Deflation can also be problematic. It can lead to a downward spiral where consumers delay purchases in anticipation of lower prices, businesses cut back on investment, and the economy slows down.
So price stability is the goal.
Generally, yes. A stable price level allows for more predictable economic activity and helps to avoid the distortions caused by both inflation and deflation.
Now, let's delve into the world of government finance and debt. What are some key economic principles to consider here?
When it comes to taxes, Sowell points out that the economic burden of a tax doesn't always fall on the person or entity that legally pays it. Taxes can be shifted either forward to consumers through higher prices or backward to producers through lower profits.
So even if a tax is levied on businesses, consumers might end up paying for it in the form of higher prices.
Exactly. And the amount of shifting depends on the elasticity of supply and demand. If demand is inelastic, meaning people are willing to pay a higher price, then businesses can more easily pass the tax on to consumers.
So it's not always obvious who's really bearing the burden of a tax. What about government debt? Is it always a bad thing?
Sowell argues that we need to look at the size of the debt relative to the size of the economy. A large debt might be sustainable for a large and growing economy, but it could be a burden for a smaller or stagnant one.
So the debt to GDP ratio is a key metric.
Right, and it's also important to consider the reasons for the debt. If the government is borrowing to invest in infrastructure or education, those investments can generate economic growth that helps to pay off the debt. But if the debt is due to excessive spending on things that don't contribute to economic growth, that's a different story.
It's about being responsible with borrowed money, just like with personal finances. Now, throughout the book, Sowell keeps returning to the topic of government intervention in the economy. What are some of his overarching conclusions or concerns?
He's generally skeptical of the idea that government intervention is always the solution to economic problems. He argues that those interventions often have unintended consequences, and that the incentives in the public sector are different from those in the private sector.
Meaning what?
Well, businesses are driven by profit and loss. If they don't serve their customers well, they lose money and eventually go out of business. Government agencies, on the other hand, don't face the same market pressures. They might be more concerned with political considerations than with efficiency or customer satisfaction.
So even when government interventions are well-intentioned, they might not achieve their desired outcomes.
Exactly, and they can even make things worse. Sowell cites numerous examples throughout the book. from rent control to agricultural price supports, where government intervention has led to unintended and often negative consequences.
It's a reminder that the economy is a complex system, and trying to micromanage it from the top down can often do more harm than good. Now, Sowell talks about this idea of zero-sum thinking that often pops up in economic debates. What is that, and why is it problematic?
Zero-sum thinking is the belief that one person's gain is always another person's loss. It's a very limited view of the world. Sowell argues that in a market economy, transactions can be mutually beneficial. Both parties can gain from voluntary exchange.
So it's not always a fixed pie, where if someone gets a bigger slice, someone else has to get a smaller one.
Right. The pie can grow. Trade and specialization can lead to greater overall wealth, creating a win-win situation for everyone involved.
This is especially relevant to international trade, right? What are the economic arguments in favor of free trade?
The core argument rests on the principle of comparative advantage. Even if one country can produce everything more cheaply than another country, both countries can still benefit from specializing in what they do relatively best and then trading with each other.
So even if the U.S. can produce both cars and computers more cheaply than, say, Japan, it might still make sense for the U.S. to focus on computers and import cars from Japan.
Exactly. If Japan is relatively more efficient at producing cars, then both countries can gain from specializing in trading. This leads to greater overall output and lower prices for consumers.
It's about leveraging each country's strengths. What about trade deficits? Are they always a bad thing?
Sowell argues that a trade deficit by itself doesn't necessarily mean a country is doing poorly economically. It could simply reflect strong consumer demand or a high level of investment, both of which can be signs of a healthy economy.
So it's important to look at the bigger picture and not just focus on the trade balance.
Exactly. And what about the argument that foreign investment in developing countries is a form of exploitation?
Right, that's a common critique.
Sowell challenges that view. He points out that many of the poorest countries in the world are those with the least foreign investment. Foreign investment can bring much-needed capital, technology, and jobs, helping to raise living standards.
So the problem isn't too much foreign investment, it's too little.
Often, yes. Of course, there are always concerns about the terms of those investments and whether they're truly benefiting the host country. But the idea that foreign investment is inherently exploitative, Sowell doesn't buy it.
Okay, now let's talk briefly about foreign aid. Does it actually help developing countries?
Sowell is pretty skeptical about the effectiveness of traditional government-to-government foreign aid. He argues that it often doesn't reach the people who need it most, and that it can create dependency and corruption.
So what's the alternative?
He believes that creating a stable and business-friendly environment within developing countries is more important than just giving them money. When people have the opportunity to improve their own lives through work and entrepreneurship, that's when real development happens.
It's about empowering people, not just handing them handouts. Now, Sowell concludes the book by debunking some common myths about markets. Can you highlight one or two of those?
Sure. One common myth is that identical goods sell for vastly different prices, suggesting that the market is somehow unfair or irrational. But Sowell points out that those price differences often reflect differences in quality, convenience, or brand reputation.
So it's not just about the physical product itself, it's about all the other factors that go into the buying decision.
Exactly. Another myth is that big businesses use predatory pricing to drive out smaller competitors and then jack up prices once they have a monopoly.
Ah, the classic evil corporation narrative.
Right. But Sowell argues that this strategy is rarely successful in practice. Lowering prices below cost is a risky move, and it's often unsustainable in the long run.
So those myths about markets, they often don't hold up under scrutiny.
Exactly. And that's Sowell's message throughout the book. Think critically, challenge assumptions, and understand the underlying economic principles at play.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, hopefully.